From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
Fewer squatters could mean fewer fires in otherwise vacant buildings. The legislature considers action. Also, Republican lawmakers override the governor, enacting their ban on gender reassignment treatment for minors. That as transgendered veterans react to the change in federal policy banning them from military service. But first, Sedgwick County property owners will have to pay even more taxes this year. Valuations continue to go up at a rapid pace. What can be done? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jared Cerullo. Property values continue to rise. 87% of residential property owners in Sedgwick County will have to pay even more in property taxes this year. That's according to county appraiser Mark Clark. The assessed value for residential property will jump an average of 9%. KSN's Zena Taher takes a look at what elected leaders are doing to provide some relief.
87% of Sedgwick County properties are up in value this year. The median change in value this year is an increase of 9%. Property value alone isn't the only thing that determines property tax, but it's a large part. Property owners will start getting letters in March going over their home and property valuations for 2025.
It will inform property owners what the value is, perhaps what the proposed budget is for various taxing jurisdictions where they live.
Valuations are part of the overall property tax equation. Needed budget is divided by assessed value of properties to determine the mill levy. Then the mill levy multiplied by the assessed value determines how much property owners pay in taxes.
Unfortunately, hikes like this, it's for taxing some folks out of their homes, and it's very unfortunate.
With 87% of homes in Sedgwick County increasing in value in 2025, the amount homeowners pay in taxes is projected to go up. County commissioners say they're looking into ways to rely less on property taxes.
We are constantly looking at spending levels, property taxes only being used for core services. What are the areas for reform? How can we share more services? How can we modernize county government?
Last month, the commission tabled one discussion on limiting property tax spending until October. That would be after the county is expected to approve next year's budget. So if they make changes, property owners likely won't feel that impact until at least 2026. The county appraiser says as property owners get those letters, if you see a valuation that looks off base, you should start the process to appeal. Here for you, Zena Taher, KSN News 3.
Here to discuss this rising tax burden and how it may factor into Tuesday's Wichita school bond election is Cake News senior political reporter Pilar Pedraza, Wichita Eagle reporter Kylie Cameron, former Wichita City Councilman Brian Fry, and former Wichita Civil Rights Commissioner Richard Harris. First off, thank you to all of you for joining us today. Brian, I'll start with you since you were a former city councilman, very familiar with property tax levies, the mill rate. Here we go again. You know, the city and the county will say, well, the rate's staying the same.
Yeah, I don't know how much more of this I can take.
Yeah.
I've had increases on my property over the last several years in a row. And this year we made a small improvement to our backyard with the patio. I'm fully expecting it to be greater than 10%. You know, my last 2 years on the council, I tried to lower the the mill rate at the city level and was denied. I didn't get enough votes for it. But I think you're seeing the public is it's the #1 issue for all electeds this last election cycle. Everyone up for re-election, it was property tax, property tax, property tax. And certainly there's multiple levels. There's the city, there's the county, there's the school boards, and everyone's got a piece of that. And we've got to rein it in somehow. Because again, I don't know how much more of this I can take, and I'm not alone.
Richard, what say you?
Well, one of the things we have to face up to is the fact that the homes that we live in now have greater value because of inflation, because of the shortage of housing, because of poor city and county management of housing development. And these consequences come with higher price tags. We have a large investment in our housing, and we need to be prepared to pay more in what we have for what we have because we have more.
Yeah. Pilar, do you think this is a hypothetical question, granted, but do you think this will have an effect on the school bond election next week?
I don't see how it can't. Not only is it going to have an effect, I think this is a horrible blow to the district and the supporters. They are going to lose votes over this no matter what they do, because people vote their pocketbooks. They do all the time. And this is going to be a bigger issue, I think, also as we continue to move on. You know, before the legislative session, as I'm speaking with the speaker, as I'm speaking with the Senate president, as I'm speaking with, you know, gubernatorial candidates, property taxes are the top thing that they're all talking about. Everybody is saying the same thing Brian's saying. We've got to make cuts. We've got to change things. And yet the votes never happen, because the fact of the matter is governments have the same bills to pay that you and I do, and their costs are going up too. And so they've still got to cover those rising costs as well. It's a lose-lose situation for folks who are going before voters, no matter what they do right now.
Kylie, chime in here.
I think just looking ahead, it's also not looking good, you know, if we want to think about the future, unless, you know, city, county, state, school board, you know, lower their mill levies, lower their budgets, it's just going to continue to rise. And a lot of that, too, is likely going to be because of, you know, and Mark Clark said this during his presentation, if Trump's tariffs on Canada and Mexico go into effect, that affects 70% of the construction products that you need to use when building homes. So then, you know, again, if those go into effect, it's not looking good for homeowners and people who own property.
And when we talk about trying to cut spending as well, it seems like always the first places that people or elected leaders want to cut are the libraries, the public parks, and things like that. Well,
again, there's got to be some service realignment here. If you would have told me 30 years ago that the city was going to get into all these things and keep the mill levy the same, there have probably been some things that the city shouldn't have got into, whether it's libraries or parks or cultural attractions, whatever.
And the city likes to use that argument.
You have to make tough choices along the way, because with this increase, I don't think you're going to see increase in service levels. If anything, you're going to see a reduction in it. And quite frankly, people aren't building new houses. I mean, we were lucky enough to get an interest rate a few years ago on a refinance at 2.75. What's the interest rate now? It's over 6
or 7, yeah.
No one's building houses because there's still people living off of those interest rates because you're not refinanced. So it's a tough situation.
Yeah.
One of the things that this is doing is it's putting pressure on infill housing finally, and there's finally some real development in the inner city, which is long overdue and been neglected by the city and the county, but real economics are forcing it finally.
And you're also seeing a change along those lines in people's attitudes toward housing. The increase in multi-generational housing is going up because of all of this, and you're seeing more people turn toward smaller properties, the tiny home, or even just moving into a townhome instead of an independent house, things like that. Just complete changes in attitudes toward what makes a good choice.
People are being more realistic about their housing now.
That's true. All right, we'll move on. This week, Senate and House Republicans overrode the governor's veto of a bill that bans so-called gender-affirming care for minors. This comes as the Trump administration reinstates a ban on transgender people serving in the military. KAKE's Kate Devine talked with some transgender veterans about the policy change.
I can't see the government we fought for being like this. We always thought it would have our back like we had its.
Christine LeBeau, a transgender woman, served almost 2 years in the Army prior to transitioning.
There's so many other people that wanted to serve our country and have served our country, and now we feel betrayed by the country that we served for these ideologies that are pushing towards extreme prejudice.
LeBeau and her wife, Rashana Grant, along with some transgender service members and veterans, say they feel abandoned after President Trump signed an executive order last month reinstating a ban on transgender people in the military. The order prohibits anyone transgender from enlisting and prevents those already serving from medically transitioning while in the military.
To ensure that we have the most lethal fighting force in the world, we will get transgender ideology the hell out of our military. It's going to be gone.
Supporters of the policy argue it ensures military readiness, while opponents like LeBeau and Grant say it unfairly targets qualified service members. LeBeau says gender doesn't affect a service member's ability to do their job.
In my opinion, a transgender can fire a weapon or do what she's asked just as well as anybody else can. Being transgender doesn't change our mentality that much. It actually makes us sharper.
The Defense Department estimates about 4,000 active duty service members have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, the feeling that you don't align with your gender you were assigned at birth. While the policy debate continues, LeBeau says her fight isn't about special treatment, just equal respect.
I want to be treated equally with respect. That's it.
A tough discussion to have. Kylie, I'll start with you. Does it, the package suggested that this affects military readiness. Do you think it does affect military readiness, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I'm a journalist.
Okay.
So, you
Sure,
know,
understood.
I'm not going to insert my personal opinion in this, but I will say, you know, growing up as a military brat, I think it's an anomaly to me that, you know, we're barring people from serving in the military that would want to. And I think that's all I'm going to say on that.
All right. Pilar, what do you have to say?
Well, I'm going to keep my opinion to myself as well because also still a journalist.
Yeah.
But what I will say is, as a historian, as I listen to the arguments involved in this, I'm hearing the same arguments that we heard in the early 1900s, all the way through World War II, about integrating the races, about allowing women to serve. So whether or not I believe it's the right thing, I'm seeing a pattern that I have seen before.
All right. Richard, a civil rights commissioner, tell me what you think about this with your background.
Well, I think all the transgender fuss nowadays is an attempt to distract from bigger issues. When we take a look at the 4,000 people diagnosed with gender dysphoria in the U.S. military, that is less than 1/5 of 1% of the 2 million service people in the United States. We don't have a readiness issue with transgenders. What we have a readiness issue with is inadequate equipment, inadequate training, inadequate personnel. We were 40,000 short on our recruiting requirements for last year, and we're going to get rid of 4,000 people. That's just wildly impractical governance, and it's an attempt to distract from the bigger issues that require spending that the wealthy who dominate the Republican Party do not want to see.
A lot of this argument, Brian, has to do with government funding. The conservative standpoint is that we don't want government funding paying for gender affirmation, gender affirmative care, correct?
I think that's what was in the order from President Trump, was the didn't want to allow for enlisting and then paying for the transition surgery. And I think that's part of a general bigger picture of the cost of military and the Department of Defense. I mean, billions and billions of dollars are potentially at risk there. That's a small piece of the bucket, right? Look, serving in the military is the ultimate sacrifice. And if someone wants to serve in military and defend our country, let them.
All right. Wichita firefighters are sounding the alarm, and state lawmakers seem to be listening. A new bill making its way through the Kansas State House seeks to speed up the process for removing squatters from vacant buildings. Cake's Pilar Pedraza shows us why some say it could be a lifesaver.
We always take in consideration that there's possibly persons trapped inside.
Which means when firefighters arrive to a scene like this one on Saturday or this one Monday morning with a fully involved fire in a vacant building, they know they're going to have to search for an unknown number of people because of possible squatters.
When the homeless or squatters get access inside, it's a warming fire that they'll start.
A danger that gets more prevalent as the temperatures drop and those without regular shelter seek a place to warm up.
And it's not being able to just contain in one specific area. Once it gets out of control, and that's when there's report of a house fire or even a building fire in these types of structures.
Firefighters say the best defense against vacant building fires, whether a squatter starts it or there's an electrical short or other spark, is the property owner keeping track of what's going on inside the building.
House Bill 2378 establishes the Removal of Squatters Act.
Supporters say a proposal lawmakers considered Monday would make that a bit easier by making it faster to get squatters off your property.
You know, if you go through the legal process, you've got to first get a district court hearing and all that kind of stuff, and then you've got to get a judge to tell them they have X amount of time to get out. It can take months.
Instead, the proposed change would allow the local sheriff's office to evict a squatter who's unrelated to the property owner and has no lease within just a couple of weeks after the owner fills out some basic paperwork.
This is meant for when they have no legal right to be there.
So, Pilar, I'll start with you. You mentioned the owner. A lot of times with these buildings, we're dealing with absentee landlords and absentee owners. So how do we get these owners to sign the paperwork?
Well, that's a whole nother story. In this particular case, this bill was aimed at owners who are still involved with the property, whether it's, you know, a relative has passed and we're dealing with probate before we can sell the property off, things like that, or we're, you know, one of the buildings that the fire that was mentioned on Saturday in that story was one where it was actually in the process of the owner trying to get everything lined up so that they could demolish it. So the owner had already been in contact with the fire department, et cetera. That's why the fire department knew that there were squatters on the property and were prepared for the search. It actually went much faster and they were able to handle it much better because of that communication with the owner that had been going on. Owners who are completely absentee, that's a whole nother story, probably a different bill.
Yeah, all right. Kylie, what do you have to say?
I think we're seeing this problem increasing, and I cannot tell you how many fires like this I've had to report on.
Yeah, I've lost count.
Yeah, right? We've lost count.
Right.
You know, we're seeing an increase in this, and, you know, I'm saying this as someone who talks to housing experts, who talks to people who, you know, help the homeless. We're seeing this because we lack affordable housing, because we lack transitional housing in our community. And that's something that needs to be addressed, and I think that goes back to the property tax conversation that we had. Yeah. That goes back to the affordability of building right now, of renovating homes, and everything else that you need to do in order to get people into housing and into the services that they need.
Yeah. All right. Brian Fry, from a former city council person standpoint, how do you deal with this type of problem?
Oh, it's a struggle. I mean, we dealt with condemned structures and how many months and weeks and years to get a condemned structure taken out because we couldn't find the owners, right? And we'd have related squatters and so forth. And seeing these buildings like this on fire and the risk that it builds for our firefighters and the people trying to contain it and the neighbors, it's just completely unnecessary. When if we can do something that helps speed the process up and get these owners to take care of their property and then also get the squatters out, we got to do something.
Yeah, and then, you know, the longer this goes on, then the city has to take care of it and step in, and it's just not fun.
But there, you know, it's more than just affordable housing. It's, you know, there's also people that just don't want to go into housing or go into shelters. They want to live out on the streets because of either mental abuse, mental health or substance awareness issues. So it's an ongoing problem that I don't know if there's a quick and easy fix.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out too that I believe one of the vacant building fires from this weekend, the larger one, was a city-owned property. The city did use that for storage for a number of years. And it's even hard for them to keep up on this.
Yeah. Richard?
Two things. One is that it's important to keep an eye out on this. A lot of people in the legislature are going to try to use this as an excuse to create a fast way to evict regular tenants who are on month-to-month contracts or no contract at all. And that the way they're wording it right now, it would provide them an excuse to do that. The other issue is basically what Kylie has said. This is a fact that the city has not taken care of the homeless issue seriously for a long time. The city's only put $380,000 of the city's own money into the homeless issue. The $2 million that they spent was federal money awarded by Biden, and I guarantee you Trump isn't going to put that money out there for the homeless. If the city doesn't get serious about putting its own money into solving the homeless problem in this community, these fires are going to continue.
Let me ask you a quick question though about your first point. Why would the legislature want to evict people from their property?
A lot of landlords just don't want to have to go through any process at all to be able to evict somebody they're not happy with, and including in a time of rising rents when they think they can get better rent from somebody else. Understood.
Yeah. All right, our last story, the Trump administration's cost-cutting efforts have hit hard at a small, federally run university in Lawrence. Students say they're being left in the lurch after a third of the staff and faculty were let go. Cake's Nick Nelson has that story.
It was sad to see our favorite teachers and staff being laid off. Yeah, we're all scared.
Haskell Indian Nations University is one of the latest federal institutions the Trump administration's reinstatement of Schedule F has impacted. Madeline Gray Goodfox is a sophomore at the college in Lawrence, which the federal government runs through the Department of the Interior. She says students received an email over the weekend from the university's president on the matter, but they still have no idea what this means for their classes or extracurricular activities.
And our classes are non-existent right now. We don't have any more schedules, so we're all just kind of hanging out on campus and waiting to see what happens on Tuesday, because Monday is President's Day.
Maricel Gallegos is a student at Haskell who grew up in Wichita. She says it's important for the Native community in her hometown of Wichita to know what's going on at Haskell and in Indian country as a whole.
It's very important for our community in Wichita to know everything, or as much as there is to know, because I feel like in Wichita we don't get that type of education when it comes to this culture.
Gallegos, along with more than 100 other Haskell students, are trying to come up with ways to make sure the world knows their chance for an education is at risk. From writing letters to staging a protest next Friday.
We've been sharing it to each other. So yeah, it's definitely a lot of the students are standing up. I don't want to say it's surprising, but it's amazing to see.
So Richard, I'll start with you this time. Tell me your thoughts here. I mean, we've heard not only that this affecting universities, but agriculture, farming, the Trump cuts, the federal layoffs.
We're just seeing some really wild and reckless and indiscriminate cuts by the Trump administration, and happening with absolutely no sense of proportion, control, or responsibility. And this is a classic example where we're throwing people basically to the wind, rather than trying to provide an orderly transition from one situation to another. And this is not helped any, of course, by the fact that Haskell has been very badly run, and bipartisan committees have condemned it. But that said, that was not the reason for these layoffs. The reason for these layoffs was a sweeping, reckless policy by the Trump administration. And one of the problems here is that they're throwing away all the probationary employees who are among the lowest cost employees. So if you're really trying to do cost cutting, this isn't the place to start.
I spoke with one of those employees also later in the week, the coach of the women's basketball team up in Haskell. And to your point, while he would not share the actual letter with me because he didn't want to run afoul of the administration, because he is actually still voluntarily coaching without pay the team because they're in playoffs right now, and he didn't want to abandon his team. But he said that the letter was a form letter, where it was very obvious that they had just inserted his name, and it's, talked about, not doing his job to basic standards and stuff like that. And he's like, my team's been winning.
Yeah. Performance-based, but exactly. Don't have any write-ups, don't have any,
And so there's definitely a lot of confusion, especially with Haskell. There are a lot of other issues going on there, as you mentioned. There's an effort underway right now from Representative Tracy Mann and Senator Moran to actually remove Haskell from federal control and put it under a board of regents run by the tribes. That would have actually prevented something like this from happening Another thing that we were watching, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we're keeping an eye on Eisenhower Presidential Library, because JFK Presidential Library in Massachusetts closed down because they lost several employees to these probationary layoffs as well, and we don't know what, if anything, because of the unfortunately the cold weather. They've been closed all week because of that, so we're not sure exactly what impact it may have on them as well.
Understood.
And I keep hearing more and more every day of people being laid off because of, you know, the current administration. You know, things that I didn't even think were maybe even connected to the federal government or would be connected to these layoffs. And a lot of these things are important jobs. One of them being, you know, I heard yesterday from a friend who, you know, works in mental health and substance use issues, and he was telling me about a couple of his buddies who were laid off from SAMHSA, which is a large organization that does help people with mental health and substance use issues, and it's an incredibly important organization that does that work, and they help even at the local level. I believe there's, you know, in my reporting that I've done on substance use issues, there's several smaller organizations within our locality, within the state of Kansas, that has received funding from SAMHSA because they don't get enough funding from the state or, you know, whoever else it is that they need funding from.
Right. Brian Fry?
Well, I'm a little confused because I've heard cuts of 20% of staff and I've heard 35%. So I don't know what the true number is here. And I guess they're also probationary employees, so they're new employees. If Haskell is growing to that extent that they need another 20 to 35% employees, that's one thing. If they're not, then this is probably a realignment that puts it back in focus. And that's what I think Trump is trying to do with these cuts, is that the growth of government has just gone off the rails and trying to pull it back some and return money to the taxpayers.
Yeah. Richard, I do, you know, remember just a few years ago, it seemed like everybody was talking about how bloated the federal government has gotten and how federal spending is out of control. And now that we have someone that seems to be doing something about it,
well, you
there's
know,
quite an argument.
You could have a house that needs repairs and needs some trimming, and some trees that need trimming. That's not the same thing as cutting down the tree or putting a hand grenade in.
But I don't think anyone's cutting down the tree here. I think they're just asking for it to be in alignment with what the growth and the capacity of the college is. Now, if there are treaties that the government has with Haskell, that's a different story.
Haskell's been growing.
That's all the time we have this week. Thank you so much to Pilar Pedraza, Kylie Cameron, Brian Fry, and Richard Harris for being here. And thanks also to Cake and KSN for sharing their stories with us. I'm Jared Cerullo. We'll see you back here next week.